I think, good morning, everybody. I think we can start with this honorable presentation. Let me first of all welcome all of you to ISS in Aula Pocchiari for this talk with Professor Alvin Roth from University of Stanford. Let me first of all introduce the president of ISS, Professor Rocco Bellantone, who will give us an introductory speech. Please, Professor.
Thank you. I'm truly honored to usher in today the scientific lecture series that the Istituto Superiore di Sanità is dedicated to the 19th anniversary of its founding with a lecture by Nobel laureate Professor Alvin Roth. To Professor Roth, I want to extend my warm welcome to this institute, which throughout its history has hosted the work of 4 other Nobel laureates, Hans Boris Chain, Daniel Beauvais, Enrico Fermi, and Rita Levi-Montalcini. So I hope the professor can feel at home in this place that is the highest expression of public health research in Italy. This is perhaps the first time, however, that our institute hosts such a distinguished representative of economic studies and not a Nobel laureate from the world of medicine, physics, or natural sciences. This makes this morning's event even more peculiar. Precisely 20 years ago, in May 2004, the article Kidney Exchange by Professor Roth and his colleagues Typhoon Somnetz and Utku Umber was published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. In this article, his matching theory was described by applying it to the problem of donor-recipient compatibility in living kidney transplantation and the need to find enough donors for patients waiting for an organ. Roth proved mathematically that by cross-referencing the immunological data of all pairs in which a healthy person wants to donate a kidney to his or her sick family member, but cannot do so due to lack of compatibility, all patients would be able to receive the organ they need. For these studies on stable allocation, called by the Royal Swedish Academy of Science a masterpiece of economic engineering, Professor Roth was awarded the Nobel Prize in 2012. But let me say that perhaps even greater recognition of the value of Roth's work has come from the fact that science that inside physician researchers and health institutions in many countries around the world have developed living donor kidney transplantation programs between incompatible couples that have contributed and continue to contribute to the salvation of thousands of patients. This is also the case in Italy, where the crossover transplantation program has been further enriched, as we shall hear from Professor Lucrezia Furian on behalf of Centro Nazionale Trapianti. Professor Roth's work is therefore worth much more than the gold medal he was awarded. It is, above all, a demonstration that research in every field and across the board can always have the ambition to put itself at the service of mankind and the common good, and to achieve concrete and positive change for society as a whole. I therefore leave the floor to the speaker, entrusted by Dr. Giuseppe Feltrin, General Director of Centro Nazionale Trapianti. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Bellantone. Let me just say some words, first of all, to all dear colleagues to here and online, to thank you for being here. And it's really a great honor for me to warmly welcome Professor Alvin Roth, who was so kind to accept our joint invitation between CNT and ISS to give in a lecture during the celebration of the 19th anniversary of ISS. CNT, as you learned before, is a proud technical branch of ISS for transplant coordination. Just to give you the rationale of the presence of an economist in a sanitary institution without unveiling the inspiring work that made by Professor Roth, I like to quote a sentence that he wrote in a paper that he wrote in 2015. When my economist colleagues and I started to assist transplant professionals in organizing kidney exchange over a decade ago, many people, both physicians and economists, were surprised by the collaboration. But it shouldn't have been so surprising, because economics is about cooperation, coordination, competition, and exchange. And so is transplantation. Dear all, indeed, this is the fil rouge linking Professor Roth's masterwork and the Italian Transplant Network. CNTs is continuously striving to tackle self-sufficiency in organ donation, and I think, Professor Roth, you will cover this topic during your presentation. Implementing organ donation in Italy to the highest level in its history in 2023, supporting, for example, DCD donation programs, even in the framework of the 20 minutes not touch period. Even though we are all aware that there is still a big work to be done, all these tasks for which I'm continuously, gratefully thanking for our donation and transplantation professionals and volunteers, these tasks are carried on with the noblest goal to fill the gap between demand and supply. Once again, an economical concept, you will forgive me for this. And where the demand is represented by the nearly 8,000 people still waiting for an organ on our waiting list. As you would listen from our first speaker, Professor Lucrezia Furian, CNT has been doing an intense effort to support kidney transplantation, both from deceased and living donors, putting into the field also vanguard and pioneeristic programs, aiming to support kidney pair exchange as a means to increase the potential for transplantation for our recipient in specific settings. So now I want to stop speaking and I want to introduce Professor Lucrezia Furian. She is the head of the Department of Kidney and Pancreas Transplantation and at the University of Padua, and I have to publicly thank her for the great support that she gave to the realization of this event. So, Lucrezia, the podium is yours.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, and I'm very much honored to be here. First of all, because I have the honor to welcome Professor Roth, who has inspired our work, what we did together with Giuseppe Antonio Nicolò in the past years. So thank you for the inspiration. And I'm so very honored to speak on behalf of the Italian National Transplant Center and present you some data about kidney transplant activity in our country. Starting with numbers, every year we have 2,000 patients with end-stage renal disease having been registered in the waiting list for transplantation, and only 1,910 transplants have been performed in 2023. I'm saying only, not because it's not a good number, but because we need more. And as a matter of fact, we have now more than 8,000 patients on the waiting list, and they have an average waiting time of 3 years, 0.1. For those who receive a transplant, the mean waiting time is 1.7 years, with a satisfaction of the list, which is about 33%, which is good, but not perfect. The mortality on the waiting list is much smaller than what we see in other life-saving organs, but it's 2.1%. But we have to consider that there is a large number of patients who are withdrawn from the list for other reasons, meaning that they're not suitable for transplantation anymore, and they will have to spend the rest of their life on dialysis. The annual rate of deceased donor kidney transplantation in Italy is, I would say, very similar to that of the northern countries of Europe. It's 28.1 parts per million. It's smaller for living donor transplantation, we have 5.6 parts per million. And if you compare this data with UK or with the Netherlands, you see there is quite a big difference. But we are working to improve this gap. Going to the detail of kidney pair donation, in living donor transplantation, it happens in 1/3 of the cases that there is no compatibility between the donor and the recipient. This is mainly due to HLA incompatibility, and it happens when the recipient has had blood transfusions or pregnancies or previous transplants, and it is very hard to overcome with desensitization. The other option is ABO incompatible, so blood type incompatibility. Here it's possible to desensitize with better results, but the best result is to obtain a compatible pair. And this is possible when you match the donors and the recipients of different pairs in order to perform compatible transplant. In Italy, in 2023, there were 25 transplant centers actively involved and registering patients for a kidney pair donation. There were 116 patients in 2023, and 50 out of them received a transplant through a kidney pair exchange in one of the different programs. The most classical program is the crossover, the so-called 2 or 3-way cycles. And there were 18 cases in 18 pairs transplanted from 2005 when the program started until 2023. An additional program is the altruistic donation, the so-called non-extended altruistic donor chains, where an altruistic donor donates in favor of the population. And it has happened since 2015 8 times in Italy, only 8 times, enabling 26 transplants and allowing 19 pairs to be transplanted. But the most effective program is the so-called DEC program, the Deceased Donor Initiated Chains, which has been started back in 2018 in our center in Padua, in Veneto. After the pilot experience with the first 5 cases, we were able to have a national program very soon, and since then 25 kidneys from a deceased donor were used to initiate a chain of transplants. 45 incompatible pairs found a compatible transplant, and 69 transplants were performed. It means that with 25 kidneys, you multiply almost by 3 the number of transplants performed, and that's one of the reasons I'm very grateful, Professor Roth. Additionally, one last option is to increase the pool of pairs, including other countries. We have international collaboration with Spain, Portugal, and Italy to match together in the same algorithm the pairs, and we were able, over the years, to perform 5 transplants with 5 incompatible pairs. 4 cases were 2-way cycles. In one case, more complicated, it was a 3-way cycle. And very last but not least, we are now working in the center of Padua and in Policlinico Gemelli, because it has been signed an agreement in September 2022 between Italy and the United States, and the patients from the Italian patients and American patients will match together with an algorithm. Through this algorithm, we will be able to perform, hopefully, more compatible transplants in the next future. Thank you.
So, Professor Roth, you had the opportunity to see what was the work that the Italian Transplantation Network has tried to do in order to implement kidney donation, kidney pair donation. But before, I want to give the floor to Professor Nicolò, that I will call in a second, and we give him the honor to introduce your cursus honorum to us all. But before, let me say some words about Antonio Nicolò. Antonio Nicolò is coming from the Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona. He's a professor of economics at the University of Padua, and he also has a fractional appointment at the University of Manchester. He has held a visiting position at various prestigious institutions, including the Department of Economics and Becker-Friedman Institute at the University of Chicago, the Indian Statistical Institute, and the European University Institute. His research interests lie in the fields of social choice theory, mechanism design, matching theory, and political economy. Antonio has served as the president of the Association of Southern European Economic Theorists and is currently a member of the Council of the Society for Social Choice and Welfare. Antonio, the floor is yours, and you will please introduce Professor Roth. Thank you so much.
Dear President, esteemed Professor, dear audience, it's a great honor to introduce an intellectual giant in the field of economics, a thought leader whose groundbreaking work has reshaped our understanding of market and mechanism, Professor Alvin Roth. Professor Roth is not only a laureate of the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences, which was awarded in 2012, for his seminal work on the theory of stable allocation and the practice of market design, but he is also a mastermind who bridges theoretical insights with impactful real-world application. Professor Roth is what we could call the engineering economist. His work consists of designing and creating new markets that make it possible to allocate scarce resources more efficiently and equitably. Economics is sometimes perceived as a science of price or money. Economics, in fact, is about scarce resources. Economists like prices because they are useful tools to transmit information about individual preference, economic cost. However, in several situations, such as school, university admission, organ donation, entry-level labor market, for either legal or ethical reason, there is a need to find a way to allocate scarce resources that are alternative to prices. His work on the design of the National Resident Matching Program, which matches medical residents with hospital, and the New England Program for Kidney Exchanges for incompatible donor recipients are just a few examples of how his theories have been successfully put into practice for the betterment of the society. He is certainly the economist who has contributed to saving the greatest number of lives. Professor Roth currently holds a position at Stanford University, where he continues to push the frontiers of economic science, encouraging us to rethink how we perceive choices, cooperation, competition within a complex economic system. We have much to learn from Professor Roth's insight on market design and his vision for an economy that serves the common good with efficiency and fairness. Before I give the floor to Professor Roth, I would like to take this opportunity to mention the Italian dramatist and writer Luigi Pirandello. I don't know if Professor Roth knows him, who received also a Nobel Prize in the Literature in 1934. He's an author that I like very much. In a play entitled The Pleasure of Honesty, Pirandello writes, "It is much easier to be a hero than a gentleman. A hero one can be once. A gentleman one must be every day of his own life." Professor Roth has not only been a scientific hero with his path-breaking contribution, but also a real gentleman. His generosity and passion have been passed down to a generation of doctoral students, making him an example for the profession, not only for his immense contribution to science, but also for his unwavering dedication and passion for helping others every day of his life. So without further ado, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to a true visionary and inspiration to both scholars and practitioners alike, Nobel laureate Professor Alvin Roth.
Well, thank you for those kind introductions. I'm going to tell you the same things that the previous speakers did, but a little more slowly. So, in particular, I want to tell you, about how economists come to work with transplant professionals, and congratulate you also on the 90th anniversary of the ISS. It's an important anniversary. And as Dr. Feltner already mentioned, it's also the 20th anniversary of a paper of mine that was published in May of 2004, so on kidney exchange. But but I bet it's still a puzzle to a lot of people how economists collaborate with physicians and surgeons. So I should tell you a little more about that before I tell you about kidney exchange, which is my topic today. So some years ago, I wrote a book about market design, and the title of the English version was Who Gets What and Why. And the Italian translation, the cover of the Italian translation is there. The translator and the publisher decided to call the book Matchmaking, the economic science of giving to each his own. And what I'm going to talk to you about for a little while now is how there are many different kinds of markets, and some of them, as we've already heard, some of them depend critically on prices, but others don't. Because, and the general thought for an economist is we're interested in allocating scarce resources efficiently, but also in making them less scarce. And that's part of what I'll be talking about in kidney exchange. So there are lots of different languages, and in that respect, languages are like markets, right? They're both human artifacts. We don't always think of languages as a human artifact. When you speak to each other in Italian or when you speak to me in English, we're speaking a language as we've received it. But of course, there are lots of words in the language that weren't there 100 years ago, not least language related to organ transplants, which didn't happen 100 years ago. So languages are human artifacts, and so are markets. Sometimes we think about markets as if they just occurred with no human intervention, but in fact, markets are very human institutions. And just as there are lots of different languages, there are lots of different kinds of markets. Okay, so what I'm going to talk to you about mostly today are matching markets where they're not impersonal at all, where you care who you're dealing with and the people you deal with care to know about you. And in some of those markets, prices don't do all the work, and in transplantation and others, we sometimes don't let prices do any of the work. So I may not have the latest version of my slides here, I'm not sure. But let me start by talking about a very traditional economic market, the New York Stock Exchange, right? So that's a market where prices do all the work, and you don't need to know who you're dealing with. When you want to buy 100 shares of Microsoft on the New York Stock Exchange, you don't care that the person you buy them from has been taking good care of those shares. You don't care which shares he had. All the shares are the same. So you can make an offer to the whole market. At this price, I will buy Microsoft shares, and someone else can make an offer to the whole market. At this price, I'll sell them. And when the prices meet, you can transact. And that's the job of the market, to find the prices at any moment in which supply equals demand and people can trade with each other without knowing each other. Okay? Now, a lot of markets aren't quite as anonymous as the New York Stock Exchange, but still they have the property that you can choose whatever you want if you can afford it. So here's a picture of Lamborghinis, expensive, fast cars. And they're very expensive, but if you can pay the price, you can have one. And one reason I chose these cars is because every now and then in the US we see headlines that say organs are transported in these very fast Italian cars. But of course organs are quite different than cars, because patients can't just choose kidneys, they have to have a compatible kidney. That is, there has to be a match. So anyone can buy a car who can afford it. These are hard cars to afford. But to get an organ, it's not enough to want it. It has to want you too. Okay? So matching markets are markets in which you can't just choose what you want, but you also have to be chosen. So you can't just choose a kidney, it has to be a compatible kidney for you. And there are lots of matching markets. Many of the most important markets we go through are matching markets where you can't just choose what you want, you also have to be chosen. So think about universities. You can't just choose to attend Stanford University or Sapienza. You have to be admitted. Think about labor markets. You can't just decide to go work at Google. You have to be hired. And similarly, Google and Stanford can't just choose who will work for them or who will attend. The students and the employees have choices too. Google has to compete with Facebook. So labor markets and college and university admissions are a little bit like marriage. You can't just choose your spouse. You also have to be chosen. And so there's going to be courtship involved. That is, there are going to be market institutions designed to help match people that are different than institutions that just determine prices. On the New York Stock Exchange, it's enough to find a price to let transactions happen. But that isn't how we find our spouses. It isn't how we find our jobs. It isn't how we go to university. And it's not how we get kidneys for transplantation. So before I get to kidneys, let's think a little bit about what marketplaces have to do to make markets work well. Okay, and one of the first things, and one which I'll talk a lot about when I talk about transplants, is the marketplace has to help the market become thick. And what I mean by thick is there should be enough people coming to the marketplace to transact so that it's a good place to transact and that people's needs can be satisfied. And in the context of kidneys and kidney exchange, that's going to mean having lots of patient-donor pairs prepared to exchange with each other. Now, once a market becomes thick, it starts to face problems of congestion. If there are lots of potential transactions that can be accomplished, then it might be hard to find which ones you want to do, especially if each transaction takes time and if evaluating each transaction takes time. So when you have a thick market, you also have to find a way of allowing people to investigate the transactions quickly and effectively. And lastly, markets have to be reliable and safe. They have to they're going to depend on lots of information, lots of personally identifiable information. And so they have to be a safe place to share that information. So before I get to kidneys, let me give you an example that I think will be familiar to everyone, which is Airbnb. Okay, so Airbnb is a market that matches travelers to apartments. And initially, Airbnb had a problem with thickness. They started as a website in San Francisco, and so they could find you an apartment in San Francisco if you wanted to go to San Francisco. But of course, that's not a very big business. I mean, San Francisco is a lovely city. You should come and visit. But lots of people want to go elsewhere. And so to make a thicker market, what Airbnb started to do was to buy similar websites elsewhere. And the first one they bought was called CrashPatter, which was a similar site in England. And once they had San Francisco and England, they could start serving travelers who wanted to go to San Francisco or who wanted to go to London and serve hosts who wanted to host travelers in San Francisco and in London. And they grew, and now there's Airbnb in Italy and all around the world. And their competitors today aren't just other websites, they're hotels, Hilton hotels and big Marriott hotels, big multinational hotel corporations. But Airbnb had a different problem with congestion than the hotels do. So my wife and I woke up this morning at the Hotel Palazzo Naner, and the way you make a reservation there is you call the reception desk, or you can interact with them on the internet, and you ask, do you have a room for the nights we want to come? And the receptionist there, the person who does the matching of people to rooms, looks at all the rooms, and if they have a room, they reply, yes, come. But Airbnb had a different problem because a lot of Airbnb apartments were run by hosts who had only one apartment to offer. So if you were to, in the early days, when you went on their website and you tried to reserve an apartment, sometimes other people were trying to reserve the same apartment at the same time, and you might find out only late in the day that you didn't get that apartment and you'd have to start again. So think about the difference between Airbnb and hotels. Supposing that the Hotel Palazzo Naner insisted on talking to you about one room at a time. So when you called up, you'd say, do you have a room for me for Monday night? And they'd say, well, which room do you want? And you'd say to them, how about room 101? They'd say, I'm so sorry, room 101 is taken. And then they'd hang up. And you'd call again. And you'd say, do you have a room for me for the night? And they'd say, which room do you want? You'd say, how about room 201? And they'd say, sure, come. It's available. It would be a lot harder to reserve a hotel if you had to name the room each time. But that was the problem that Airbnb faced at its inception. You would look on their website. You would see an apartment that looked nice to you. you would you would use the website to contact the owner and say, I'd like to rent your apartment. And it might be that when he got home from work that day, he would find 6 people who wanted the apartment, and he would give it to the first one, or maybe if he didn't like the looks of the first one, he'd give it to the second one. And to the others, he'd all have to say, I'm so sorry. My apartment is already booked for that night. So if Airbnb couldn't solve that problem, they wouldn't be the giant hotel competitor that they are today. And what they did is they had to really speed up the response time of hosts. They had to give them tools, and smartphones helped a lot, to reply quickly to reservations. And one of the things they do also is if you are trying to reserve some apartment, they take it off the website so no one else lines up behind you trying to reserve the same apartment. So in this way, they were able to become more like a hotel. Every place that you could try to reserve had a spot for you. Okay? And they also have a problem with trust and safety, right? You have to know that the apartment is going to look something like the picture on the website, and they have to be pretty sure that you'll leave the apartment in good condition. So both hosts and travelers have reputations. And that's how Airbnb has created a new market for housing that solved this problem of thickness and congestion and trust and safety. So I'm ready to talk to you about kidneys now. And as Dr. Furian already said, there's lots of deceased donation in the developed world, and here's a chart that shows, ordered by number of deceased donations per million population in the blue, how countries are doing in per million population, and in orange it's living donation per million population. Okay, and what you see is Italy is doing very well. It's far to the right, and by this measure, countries like China and India are doing poorly. Okay, that is, they have relatively few donations per million population, but there are lots of millions in a billion, and size matters. So the next slide I want to show you is how many total transplants get done around the world. And what you see is the US, which has a population of 330 million, is still first, but China is number 2, and India is number 3, and Brazil is number 4. Okay, so size matters, and one of the reasons size matters is that we're going to talk more about is this point that Dr. Furian already mentioned, that some people are hard to match. That is, they have preformed antibodies to lots of kidneys, and therefore finding a kidney that they can take, you have to have a very thick market. You have to have lots of possible kidneys to offer them in order to find one that will work. And so big countries have an advantage because they can have lots of deceased donors and potentially lots of living donors. I'll just point out briefly that notice that India, I can't see very well here, but India is somewhere in there, and India is mostly living donors, unlike China and the US, which are mostly deceased donors. So, and the story about living donors, as we've already heard, is that you might love someone enough to give them a kidney and save them from dying on dialysis, but you might not be able to give the person you love a kidney. And so there are fewer living donations than there should be, unless we can somehow make use of the kidneys from the willing donors who are incompatible with the patients that they want to deal with. And that's where kidney exchange comes in. So here's a simple two-way exchange between blood type incompatible patients. That's something that can, to some extent, be overcome nowadays. But what you see is donor 1 loves recipient 1 and would like to give her a kidney, but they have incompatible blood types. And donor 2 loves recipient 2 and would like to give her a kidney, but they have incompatible blood types. And before kidney exchange, what we used to do is we would send the donors home. We would say, we're so sorry, you're incompatible with the person you want to give a kidney to, go home. And the patients would remain on the long, dangerous wait for a deceased donor kidney, where many people die while waiting. So this is a simple exchange. when we started to do those simple exchanges, we found there was a problem of congestion. It was hard to do lots of them. And one reason is we would do them simultaneously. So what does it mean to do a two-pair exchange simultaneously? It means you need 4 operating rooms, right, for 2 nephrectomies, taking out the kidney, and 2 transplants, putting it in. So here's half of one of those, here's pictures of half of one of those exchanges going on in Cincinnati, Ohio. The man in the tiger skin cap is Steve Woodall. Behind me, I'm in the yellow gown, behind me, not in the other picture, but off stage is another operating room where the nephrectomy happened. But before those things happened, Steve got on his phone from the OR and he called up Mike Reese, who was in Toledo, Ohio, and he said, Mike, here in Cincinnati, we're ready. We've successfully anesthetized the patients, and we have made the initial incisions. How are you doing in Toledo? And when he heard that in Toledo they were doing the same, they were at the same stage, they went ahead and took the kidney and transplanted it. And that happened at the same time in Toledo, Ohio. And the reason they did it at the same time was you can't write a contract on a kidney. We might get to, I may have some slides on that coming up. You can't write a contract on a kidney, so what we're trying to avoid is that one pair gives a kidney and then something happens with the other part of the exchange and they don't get a kidney. But to do even a 2-pair exchange simultaneously means you need simultaneously available 4 operating rooms and 4 surgical teams. So it's hard to do. And we're a big country, it's going to be hard to scale this to a national scale if we have to only do pairwise exchanges simultaneously. So in the US, we start to have some non-directed donors. And we have a couple of hundred a year. And before there was kidney exchange, so a non-directed donor is a donor who wants to give someone a kidney and doesn't have a particular person in mind. And before there was kidney exchange, we used to put them through all sorts of tests, make sure they have 2 kidneys, make sure they're not depressed. It's hard to qualify to be a donor, but when they could, they would give to someone on the waiting list and save someone's life. But now, when you start to have a pool of patient-donor pairs, when you start to have a thick market, you can offer non-directed donors an even more enticing option, which is a non-directed donor can start a chain. He can give to the recipient of a first pair whose donor can pass it forward to a second pair whose donor can pass it forward to someone who may not have an intended donor, someone who's waiting for a deceased donor on the waiting list. Okay, and when we started to do that, again, because of the congestion, we would only do 3 transplants at a time. So when you took a picture afterward of the people who had gotten a transplant, there would be 6 of them, 3 donors and 3 recipients. And that, again, is going to make it hard to scale in a national context. So let me remind you a little more about why we were doing things simultaneously. And look at on the left, the simple kidney exchange between 2 pairs, and imagine that we didn't do it simultaneously. We pretty much do all of these simultaneously, but suppose we didn't. Then on day 1, donor 2 might give a kidney to recipient 1 and now doesn't have a kidney anymore. And on day 2, when donor 1 is scheduled to give a kidney to recipient 2, something might get in the way and the transplant wouldn't happen. And in that case, pair 2 has really been harmed because they had a surgery that didn't help them, and they don't have a kidney anymore to engage in kidney exchange going forward. So we never do those non-simultaneously. But supposing we've got a non-directed donor, now you can organize a chain so that every pair gets a kidney before they give one. And here you have a picture of, the non-directed donor gives to recipient 1 for whatever reason, same as on the left, donor 1 fails to give to recipient 2. That's very disappointing, but pair 2 isn't any worse off than they were before the non-directed donor appears, and they still have a kidney. They can take part in kidney exchange the next week. Okay, so we started to explore non-simultaneous exchanges, and Mike Reese, who's one of the heroes of this story, is the first author here, and there are economists and computer scientists and surgeons all working together here. And the first non-simultaneous donor chain, the picture at the top is the one that appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine, and the picture at the bottom appeared in People magazine, and the patients and donors had allowed themselves to be identified. And it's got 20 people in the picture. And we were still didn't know what we were doing. So the last person in the picture is Helena McKinney, who has blood type AB. And for reasons that will be apparent to many of you, it was hard to find someone in the kidney exchange pool who could take her kidney, because blood type AB kidneys can often take the kidneys of their intended donors because they're not blood type incompatible. So the people in the exchange pool who have blood type AB are hard to match. But 2 years went by and we found a good match for her. Mike Reese found a good match for her, and she added 12 more people to the picture. So you can have long chains. Now, why are long chains important? And this has to do with the thickness of the market. Okay? It turns out that when you talk about antibodies, the measure we use is called percent reactive antibody, and that tells you what's the chance that a kidney that's blood type compatible will be compatible with a given patient. And what you see is in kidney exchange, we're seeing bimodal distributions. Some people are very easy to match. They have very low PRA, but some people are very hard to match. And when you look at the people who are very hard to match in the graph on top, they're very, very hard to match. So those are people who have 99% PRA. Means there's only, if you show them 100 kidneys, there's likely to be only one that they can take. Okay, only 1% of the kidneys will be compatible with someone who has a 99% PRA. They have lots of antibodies. You can get these antibodies by having a lot of blood transfusions. You can also get them by giving birth. So childbirth gives people antibodies to the half of the proteins that the baby gets from dad. So what's going on here? So here's a visualization of a snapshot of data in a kidney exchange program. Each circle represents a patient-donor pair, and an arrow goes from one circle, one patient-donor pair, to another if the kidney of the donor in the first circle is compatible with the one at the other end of the arrow. And what you see in this picture is there's only a few, colored blue, there's only a few pairs that have a lot of incoming arrows. These are the easy-to-match pairs. And what's easy to do is to match them to each other. But that's not an efficient thing to do, because if you match them to each other, you won't be able to transplant the others. The way you match hard-to-match patients is by often matching them to easy-to-match patients. And in particular, long chains help. So here's a chain that was, for a moment, the longest in the world. This is a picture that appeared in the New York Times. And let's think for a minute about why long chains are helpful. Supposing each of us represents a patient-donor pair where the patient is hard to match. So what's the chance that my pair can give a kidney to your patient? Well, it's very small because your patient is very hard to match. But in a big room like this, there might be someone we can give a kidney to. What's the chance you can give a kidney back to us? It's very small because we're very hard to match. But in a big room like this, there's a good chance you can give it to someone else, and a good chance they can give it to someone else. And that's how a long chain forms. Okay, so chains are powerful, not just because a lot of transplants happen, but because hard-to-match patients can be included in chains when they're very hard to include in small exchanges. Okay, so here's a picture of the growth of kidney exchange in the US. It's between 20 and 25% of the living donor transplants we do in the US. When you count in orange are the non-directed donors, and in blue are the pairs that get transplanted, more than half of them in chains. Okay, so that sounds like, that sounds like some kind of success. But I could tell you, if I were inclined, I could tell you about victory after victory in a war that we're losing. When I started to think about kidney transplantation, there were 40,000 people waiting for kidneys in the United States, and today there are 90,000, right? So we're doing transplants of a sort that we didn't used to do, but we still have a big shortage of kidneys. So what are some ways, innovative ways to increase it? Well, one is to start with deceased donor kidneys. You could start a chain in the kidney exchange patient-donor pair pool with an appropriate kidney from a deceased donor. And that's exactly what Dr. Furian and Professor Niccolò have done here in Italy, where Italy is a pioneer in this. And in this early paper, they're reporting 8 kidneys that gave rise to 24 transplants. But in fact, as we've heard, they've now started with 25 deceased donor kidneys and gotten 69 transplants. So I was listening. So that's real progress, and Italy is a pioneer there. It's still going to be very hard to meet the demand of all the patients who need kidneys, but we can start to think about how to make progress in that. So there's kidney exchange in a number of European countries, but what I want to point out is that many of them have constraints on the length of chains or don't even allow chains. So among the things you can think about in Europe is loosening the tough constraints that we sometimes put on kidney exchange, letting France, for example, do more exchanges, getting more non-directed donors and using them effectively. Okay? There are other ways to innovate, and India is a place where they don't allow non-directed donors, but there's a magician, a transplant nephrologist in Gujarat named Vivek Kute, who's managed to do lots of transplants at his center without the advantage of chains. And the way he does that is, instead of having people donate their kidneys to strangers anonymously, the way we do in the US, and I think probably in Italy as well, he develops these long cycles of chains, non-simultaneous, and he has everyone meet each other beforehand and agree. This is something taken from the microfinance literature of lending pools. And he has them all meet each other and agree that we're in this together, and he takes careful precautions. The dark pairs are the ones that are going to have to wait. They're going to give a kidney before they get one. And he makes sure that those are not so highly sensitized that they couldn't get a kidney from a deceased donor if they had to. And so far, he's had great success with these in India. So there are things you can do to get more transplants out of your existing pool by allowing donors who are incompatible with their intended recipient to exchange kidneys so that every patient gets a compatible kidney from another patient's donor. Okay. Incidentally, the technology in India is quite impressive. Here I sat in on a surgery in Ahmedabad with a Da Vinci robot. So, the physician, Dr. Modi, isn't actually touching the patient. There are lots of people just off camera who are touching the patient, handling the robot. But he could, in principle, be far away from the patient, right? If he had a really good internet connection, he could be doing the surgery far from where the patient is. So there are lots of possibilities for expanding the scope. Okay, so end-stage renal disease is a global problem which needs global solutions. Even the United States, where we have 330 million people, we have patients who are so hard to match that we can't find a match for them. But kidney failure, end-stage renal disease, is these days one of the top 10 causes of death everywhere in the world, right? So I think what I want to talk to you about is how it's important to start making national boundaries not seem so important anymore. Because a country like Italy, which has about 60 million people, will often find that it's not big enough to easily transplant its hardest to match patients. Okay, so there are some international kidney exchange programs in Europe. So in Italy takes part in one with Portugal and Spain. What's it called? Nordia transplant. The northern countries have a collaboration, and Austria and the Czech Republic have merged their pools and also do exchanges with Israel. So let me tell you about that, because these are great ideas, but they're not working well in Europe now. Okay, so Here's a paper in a Brazilian journal in 2023 by some Portuguese surgeons. And what they say is they've been doing international exchange. They've been attempting to cross borders with Italy and Spain since 2017. But in that time, only 3 Portuguese patients have been transplanted that way. And the problem is that Portugal and Spain and Italy first try to transplant everyone they can domestically. And remember that visualization I showed you that showed some easy-to-match pairs and lots of hard-to-match pairs? That means that the easy-to-match pairs in each country get matched to each other. And what's left over to do internationally are the hard-to-match pairs. And it's hard to match pairs with each other. Okay, so that's why there's been very little traction in that international kidney exchange. There's a kidney exchange one that I know of, between Portugal and India. And what they talk about is they say local and regional kidney sharing options were fully explored for the Indian patient prior to embarking on international kidney sharing. That's precisely the problem. That is, if you look first to exhaust all the possibilities of exchange domestically, you're going to find that there aren't so many additional possibilities internationally. On the contrary, if what you did was, as I think, and I have a slide here, I think Austria and Czechia do, if you merge your pools, then some of our easy-to-match pairs will be matched to some of your hard-to-match pairs and vice versa, and we'll get more patients matched. Okay, so here's the story with Czech-Austrian pair donation. I think they merged their programs, but each nation has only 10 million population, right? So they're small for kidney exchange, and their kidney exchange programs are small, but they, let's see, they got 8 cross-border exchanges in their joint effort, and they've extended their joint effort to Israel, which also has a population of about 10 million. So what we're starting to see is countries that are not at an efficient scale for kidney exchange are starting to cooperate with each other to make sure that their patients have a thick market, that they can look at many potential donors to find a compatible one. Now, 2 years ago, I got to go to the United Arab Emirates for the first exchange between Israel and the UAE. And that was the patients were 3 mothers who were sensitized through childbirth. So there was an Arab-Israeli couple whose husband wanted to give her a kidney but couldn't because in childbirth she'd become sensitized to some of the proteins that their children inherited from him. And the other 2 pairs, a Jewish-Israeli pair and a pair that only wants to be identified as Arab residents of the UAE, it was daughters trying to give to mothers who were sensitized to the daughters, the paternal proteins that the daughters had. So they were able to do that exchange. And of course, there were lots of political as well as medical obstacles that had to be overcome. And some of these obstacles will have to be overcome and are not easy to overcome in general, not just between countries that have complicated histories with each other. So, you have to decide when you're doing kidney exchange across long distances whether you're going to ship the kidneys or whether the donors are going to travel. In the United States, we started around almost 25 years ago now, 24 years ago, we started with donors traveling. But today we ship kidneys all across the United States. Donors seldom travel. The fact that Israel and the UAE were able to coordinate some kidney exchange gives me hope that eventually the US and Canada will be able to coordinate. We're still unable to. Canada has a fine kidney exchange program, but these questions of traveling and paying, we have a different financial system for paying for medicine than the Canadians do, and those bureaucratic obstacles have prevented us from cooperating. And Canada has about the population of California. In other words, it would help not only the US, but it would especially help Canada to join the larger pool. And of course, different countries like the US and Canada, or like Italy and Spain, have different ways of organizing the pre- and post-operational care and things like that. So there are it's not that it's easy to merge programs, but these are all surmountable. If Israel and the UAE can do it, then the EU can do it too. And let me give you a thought experiment about how big countries or big communities like the European Union might be able to get a lot more transplants done using deceased donor transplants as deceased donor-initiated chains. So think about Denmark, which is a rich country with a fine medical system. They only have a population of about 6 million. And so in the US, we're about 55 times as large. So in Denmark, in 2020, they had 124 deceased donors. In the US, we had 12,000, so about 100 times as many. So think of the case of a Danish patient who's very highly sensitized. He has a high PRA. He's very hard to match. It's going to be, that means he can only find one kidney in 100 or a bigger number. He's going to have a very hard time finding a kidney in Denmark. Right? There just aren't enough potential donors in Denmark. So he has a very high chance of dying on dialysis in Denmark. Or he could come to the US with his intended donor, his intended living donor, and start a deceased donor initiated chain in the US if one of those 12,000 American deceased donors is compatible for him. So he has 100 times the chance of finding a compatible deceased donor in the US as in Denmark. And of course, all these things I'm saying about the US, I could say about the European Union, right? You also have a giant population. I think you're maybe 450 million. So instead of trying to do all the kidney exchanges within national borders, the EU could not only help other EU countries through coordinating in a big way, but could also open its borders to patients from countries outside of the EU. One of the reasons that's possible is that it's much more expensive to have a patient on dialysis than to do a transplant. Loosely speaking, a transplant costs about as much as a year of dialysis. But after a year of dialysis, you have to do another year of dialysis. And after a transplant, you just have to provide immunosuppressive drugs. So, so it would be possible the Danish healthcare system would be wise to pay for Danish patients to come to the US to get transplanted. But they don't. Instead, the way Danish patients do come to the US is through a private foundation that pays their American costs. But that's a clunky way to organize it. And part of the reason it's clunky is that Denmark and the US have different healthcare systems. In the EU, many countries have the same kind of healthcare system. So I think there's a real possibility that having inter-EU exchange would be much easier to establish than exchange between Europe and the EU. Now, strangely, the World Health Organization thinks that countries should be self-sufficient in transplantation. But of course, no country is. Here's a paper from, I don't see the date, 2017. Here's a paper from 2017 that says, far from being self-sufficient, lots of European citizens are waiting for a transplant. And the whole idea that countries should be self-sufficient is a very funny sound to an economist, because we don't require countries to be self-sufficient in anything else, right? When there's a famine, we don't say to countries, you should really have a more robust agricultural sector. We send food. When there's a pandemic, we don't say to countries, you need a better pharmaceutical industry. We send vaccines. And one place where we do have successful international cooperation is blood stem cells, right? This used to be called bone marrow transplantation, but now you can get blood stem cells from plasmapheresis, from less surgically than you used to. And that's a good thing, because blood stem cells have to be very closely matched in terms of all these antibodies that people can have. In terms of the immune system, the HLA match has to be very close. So I'm encouraged that Italy and the US have signed a cooperation agreement in 2022. So far, it hasn't been high volume, right? So far, we're only seeing in the US very hard to match Italian patients. But it would make a lot of sense to start showing each other a bigger set of our patients, to have a thick market. So I'm hopeful that this will come about between Italy and the US. In this picture, Mike Reese is here. I told you about him somewhere. And Ignacio Marino is here. He's sitting in the front row and running for the European Parliament. You should vote for him. And let me show you a page from a recent European Parliament regulation, which is not about solid organs. It's about other SOHOs, substances of human origin. But what it says, and let me read it to you, it says, the exchange of SOHO between member states is necessary for ensuring optimal patient access and sufficiency of supply. For certain SOHO that need to be matched between the donor and the recipient, such exchanges are essential to allow SOHO recipients to receive the treatment they need. This is, for instance, the case of blood stem cells, blood stem cell transplants, for which the level of compatibility between the donor and the recipient has to be high. So it says this requires coordination at a global level so that each SOHO recipient has as many options as possible to identify a compatible donor. So this is a statement about blood and not about organ transplants, but it could be a statement about organ transplants. And so, I think that when we come 10 years from now to the 100th anniversary of the ISS, there's still lots of work to be done, and possibly it can be in this global context. Thank you. I remember them.
So, Professor Roth, thank you so much for your presentation and so inspiring to us all. It was a real pleasure to have this presentation here, and once again, a big applause from all the audience. Thank you so much. I think we can end up here. This was a Lectio Magistralis, so thank you all for being here, and I hope you really had the opportunity to enjoy this great lecture from Professor Roth. Thank you so much.